All right, it's Movember, day 30. I'm just looking down at the clock here, 10:39. So officially there's about an hour and a half left. I'm going to have a little caveat for Movember because I've organised to speak to John Lee tomorrow in Australian time. It'll be December the 1st, but in American time, it's still the 30th. So I'm really looking forward to interviewing John. But that's not what I'm talking about tonight. Tonight I'm going to try and bring together probably a whole bunch of stuff that I've spoken about in the last 30 days. I was speaking to a friend this morning, and he said in the middle of a relationship conundrum where he falls heavily for someone and falls out and falls in and falls out, and just in that exasperated state just said, fuck, does this ever get any easier? And I said, mate, it does, but it's just hard right now. And he said, well, how do you do it? And I said, mate, I said, there is a way. And I said, you know what, tonight I'm going to explain it. But it's a hard journey, and words sometimes don't sum up what the lived experience is like, especially when you're dealing with that implicit sense of worthlessness. And as Pia Melody says, one of the hardest things about dealing with developmental trauma is that you actually feel better in the disease, or more normal in the disease, than you do in recovery in the beginning. So it feels like when you're looking after your own best interests, you're doing something wrong. But I'm going to do my best to take you through, I suppose, in a sense, the reparenting model of the developmental trauma, immaturity model of Pia Melody, and piece together a few things. So let's see if we can do it in close to 10 minutes. I can never guarantee we're going to do it in 10 minutes. I've written this thing out because I wanted to. I'm a dyslexic and have ADHD, and essentially I've just got developmental trauma, and so I get excited and overwhelmed. But essentially, what I wanted to talk about was this triangle. Pia Melody talks about she just named it the functional adult. Now Dan Siegel talks about it as being that window of tolerance where we're regulated. She essentially says that about this regulated state, that we have a good sense of self-esteem, that we can actually set personal boundaries for ourselves, external, internal, and sexual, that we know our reality, our body, our thinking, our feelings, and our behavior, and that we're centered in that we're aware, therefore, of our needs and wants, and that within that, we're functioning spontaneously and openly in the minute, in the moment. But what happens when we experience trauma? We get two senses of self. Now, these can get expanded out into, depending on what sort of trauma type you ended up with, where you're more flight and narcissistic, more fight and narcissistic, more flight and obsessive compulsive, or more freeze and disassociative. These things will reflect that. But essentially, the wounded child about self-esteem feels less than, about personal safety feels too vulnerable, about the personal sense of self feels bad and flawed, or a real immature toddler-like rebellion, tantrum-like rebellion, too needy in regards to our needs and wants, and essentially out of control. Now, what I always see when I read Dan Siegel's work about that, the idea of rigidity, chaos, and that sense of window of tolerance, that this is where I see people go into chaos. She generally says that this is about 0 to 7, and this is where the neuroscientists would tell us why this is so hard to deal with, is that essentially it's implicit memory. We do not know what the feeling state is. It's essentially these toxic levels of feelings that I'll talk about those in a moment. So when we have this is an intolerable way of being. So this intolerable way of being, we're here in this wounded child. So we will quickly go to this adapted self. We would have learned these adaptations from that family of origin, by what we saw, by the defense mechanisms and the way we were parenting. If this reflects the feelings we felt in that trauma and less than nurturing parenting. This reflects the way we were parented. This is our inheritance. We will learn to act better than in regards to our less than, in vulnerable in regards to our too vulnerable, good, perfect, or rebellious. If you're a second child in a dysfunctional family system, you're likely to be the scapegoat and more rebellious. First children, more likely to be perfect. Lost children mascots try to be good or funny. We become needless and wantless. And in a sense, the goal is to be in control, but it's quite rigid. And it's always hidden behind walls, and therefore there is no intimacy. And so living in these extremes is chaos. It's chaos. It's chaotic. It's bouncing from one to the other. It takes an incredible toll on the body. And essentially, I suppose what makes it hard is that it feels normal to be in that disease even when you get into recovery. So even when someone gets sober from an addiction of sorts, that they can still have this internal world going on. Now, to work out, well, where does this lie, is this idea of Pia Melodies about reality, that to know our reality. Now, essentially, we take in events as data, and the quantum physicists are going to tell us that there's a lot more than the five senses receiving it, and I believe that. But for the purpose of simplicity, we take it in through our senses, into our body. Now, that central nervous system, the polyvagal theory I described, if we have received trauma, it is held in our body. If we perceive threat, we will act in an irregulated state. It'll be the PTSD symptoms and the complex PTSD for us developmentally traumatized folks that immediately bypass all of what I'm just about to share for you. You'll eventually get to this, but in perceived threat, we will fight, flight, or freeze. But when that doesn't happen, or even after that's happened, and how we start to interpret that data, is that we'll run it through all the neural networks in our consciousness, their family of origin, and so that's where those trauma messages will be, the core beliefs, which are always the I am statements about self. And this is where we'll find cognitive distortions, defense mechanisms, the messages that go with family roles. And essentially that defines the meaning. That's how we would define it. And that meaning is unique to us due to this template. This template comes from us. Now, this will promote, unlike the emotional states in the body, we'll get feelings. Now, for some of us, and for things that don't trigger us, we have an adult appropriate feeling reality. We'll feel the appropriate amount of anger or pain or fear or shame or guilt or loneliness or love or joy to the situation. So we're not, even a broke clock's right twice a day. So we'll feel that appropriate amount of adult energy. But for things that trigger us, then we get the toxic level or the accumulated level. And this is that they're all hysterical in their experience. So we will feel rage at pent-up anger. We will feel depression at pent-up pain, panic, terror, and anxiety at pent-up fear. A sense of worthlessness, implicit dread about value and self, that life's not going to work out for us. Guilt can be totally immobilizing at a toxic level. Loneliness, it leads to incredible senses of isolation due to its connection to shame. Love, we can feel totally enmeshed and overwhelmed. And even joy, believe it or not, in some family systems it wasn't okay to be joyful, i.e. spontaneous and open. So we learned to sort of cram that and crush that, and it can, when experienced in our adult life, come out as hysteria. Now, all these feelings put together with unprocessed beliefs essentially lead to resentment. And resentment will then lead to certainly acting it out behaviourally. Now, what we try and do is medicate and sort of numb out the above, but when we can't, we'll see ourselves acting out familiar patterns relationally. We'll see things will be getting repetitive. But essentially, it will come out as a form of rage, either internal itself, where we'll see the inner critic that Pete Walker talks about, or then we'll act it out in our family and relationships. You know, some of the focus of MOvember has been on domestic violence, and a woman dying every day in Australia at the hands of a partner or male friend, family member, father, etc. So understanding what happens for us, starting to know our trauma story, not just the stuff from our history, but to know now how we work. In Pia Melody's Breaking Free, she says that we are powerless over ourselves, the way that we interpret this data, the messages that arrive, the toxic level of feeling that gets triggered, the patterns of behavior that are repetitive, that overwhelms us. And we're powerless over that until we treat it. Now, Siegel comes along and says, look, the triangle of human experience is the good news is the brain is not just neuroplastic, but it's malleable, that we can create new neural pathways, the neurons that fire together, wire together, but also that, he's putting forward, the research is saying that you can actually, sort of change the firing patterns of existing ones. How do we do this? Through the way the mind focuses. What we choose to focus on, our focused awareness. He uses the wheel of awareness to sort of push this point. But what we choose to focus on. Now, 12-step recovery and people coming together in community in that way have sort of proven this point that we can override what seems to be something that we're so powerless over. Old defense mechanisms, addictive behavior, etc. It's miraculous in how this can happen. What seems to do it is relationship. We're social creatures, the way we attune one nervous system to the other. And then this idea that relationship and the way the exchange of information, the way that the mind then gets this new information, this transfer of information through relationship, what we then focus on, then starts to interrupt the old way the brain functions and starts to create a new way for it to function. And this is why the presence of mindfulness now is making its way into all forms of treatment. And so it starts to create a different experience. And essentially the last thing is that we can, you see a lot of people, I suppose aspiring to, you can be anything you want to be and you can change anytime you want. And you can. You can make a new decision right now. You can leave this room and never use again, as they say in Narcotics Anonymous. The only thing you take with you is every neuron that's ever wired and fired together. You get the consequences of every decision, every life experience you've had. We can start through recovery, get new learning, create new reality checks that will help us start to challenge this old way of thinking and assign a new meaning to things. But it will take time, and for a while our old thinking is the dominant thinking. So having a really structured relapse prevention plan is essential. I see so often people falling back into the office, beaten up once again, having a sense of failure because they've had an inadequate recovery strategy. They've taken a bucket of water to a bushfire and wonder why they got burnt all over again. So if you're really struggling, please get together with a sponsor or a mentor or someone you can trust and get that reality check of what you really need in your life. Not what you're willing to do, not what you want to do, but if you're really willing to go to any lengths, get that right prescription for yourself to change your environment enough to get this new thinking. What comes from it is essentially, if I start to get this functional adult firing, when I get triggered into the wounded child, I can start to identify that and pick it up early and nurture that part of me that's in toxic shame. I learn to, when I'm really triggered and go into that fight and flight, start to contain that adult adapted child. I start to esteem the inner critic. I start to set boundaries where I put walls. I start to really tune into my reality and move to get my needs met instead of acting good and perfect or bad and flawed. Essentially, I start to get into a place of moderation where I feel centered inside myself. I get back that power of intuition, which essentially, depending on who you speak to, is that voice of God within. What's it give us relationally? It means we get to have differentiation. It means I finally get to have a gap instead of a meshment with others. I finally get to have a gap. I'm responsible personally for my self-esteem. I'm responsible for my boundary system. I'm responsible for my reality and the needs and wants that come with that. Now from that, I get to develop some compassion and I can collaborate and negotiate interpersonally with others. Now, you know that you've got triggered or you regressed if you fall back into the three things that Pia said. If I start to argue facts that my reality is more important than your reality, that I start to assign blame, that whatever's happening in my reality is a result of you and you need to change so I feel better. And if you're keeping score, if it's a long-term relationship and you're keeping score, then you know you've simply gone back into this duality, this either the wounded self and all the personas that go with that, or the adult adapted child and all the personas that go with that. So recovery is about learning that when we get triggered, if we can, to go immediately to regulate the system. Once we start to regulate a dysregulated system, we get dramatic effects. As Stephen Porges said, if we can just start to vaguely gate that nervous system through the mechanical act of breathing, all of a sudden the hormones and the chemicals in our body, the physiology, the neurochemistry changes, and we're much more relaxed. We still need to deal with that inner critic and challenge those beliefs with that new recovery thinking. But I suppose the bit that I want to say with this is that, when we get into these toxic levels of feelings, we get those old mechanisms and defenses triggered, that there's no way we can do and sort that out on our own. We're in a spiritual crisis, as Pia says. And in that spiritual crisis, I need to take the energy of that to people that can support me. Now, essentially, we can't save our ass and our face at the same time. So I've got to take a risk and tell someone what's really happening. Now, I know that people with trauma, that just sounds like the worst advice ever, because really when we perceive threat, we want to batten down the hatches and stay as safe as we can any way we can. But essentially I need to reach out so I can get some sort of God parenting with my reparenting of self. It's too hard to do on our own. And essentially we need help to nurture and we need help to contain, because it feels more normal to be in this disease than it does to be in here and acting in our own best interest. When I start to set boundaries, I'm going to feel as though I'm awful, shameful and doing something wrong. Now I know when I look at these boards myself, I think, gee whiz, how the hell am I meant to negotiate that? But you know what? I think that's how complicated it is sometimes. Pia says it can take, up to 18 months to really recalibrate and start to get a sense and get on top of these new skills. Patrick Carnes has a 30-point plan that can take 2 to 5 years of commitment, but yet changes your life forever. And I think the new interpersonal neurobiologists, they're coming along and they're telling us that, wow, if we can really work at this core level and start to attune and change how we regulate, we really get a head start on then this sort of new way of thinking that means we will see the world and be in the world differently. And I'm looking forward to Pia's new book, because she's talking about what happens, the major crime, the soul murder that John Bradshaw talks about, is that when we are and do experience abuse and get disconnected from self, that's the spiritual crisis, is we're disconnected from the energy of the universe, the God of your understanding. And so what recovery does, it gives us back that relationship with ourself. And once we get that relationship back with ourself, we can get that relationship back with the higher power of our choice. So for MOvember, 30 days. I got one more post tomorrow with John Lee. I hope this has been helpful. If you're out there and you are struggling, please reach out to anyone. Men's Line, Lifeline, the Black Dog Institute. Personal message me. I'll do my best to get back to you. But there's people out there that are listening, that are caring, that want the world to be a different place, a better place, a safer place. I believe that, and I'm glad they've been there for me, and I keep what I have by giving it away. So take care.